Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of Change Wired podcast. My name is Angela Sharina. I'm your host, your executive coach 360, someone who is passionate about human potential, change your leadership potential, creating the best version of ourselves every single day. And on this podcast, we are talking about personal change, transformation, unlocking more of our potential through body, mind, work practices, the science of behavioral change. We talk on this podcast with leadership, with scientists, with researchers, equally passionate about unlocking more human potential, researching it, delivering to people in all the different ways, applied and super practical. And also on this podcast, we are not about fluff and theories. We are about learning the best strategies and doing our best to distill all the practical wisdom. So personally and collectively, we get to grow better, faster, for more fulfilling, meaningful lives and more positive impact in the world. So without further ado, let me introduce someone who I'm super excited to have on this podcast. Joining me today as my guest, we have Dr. Martin Dubin, or Marty for short and warm. Martin Dubin is a clinical psychologist, serial entrepreneur, business coach, and advisor to C-suite executives and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Marty founded and sold a multi-million-dollar healthcare company, served as a vice president at Anthem, BCBS, and later became a partner at RHR International, working with Fortune 500 leaders and top venture capital firms. Marty's latest book that we are talking about today, Blindspotting, How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader, Harvard Business Review Press, 2025. The book distills decades of experience in Marty's experience into a practical framework for identifying and overcoming leadership or anyone's blind spots. And why is it important? Well, Marty shares that blind spots are often the flip side of our greatest strengths. And when we build self-awareness and make a small but powerful adjustment to our behaviors, daily small behaviors, and we avoid getting stuck in our default behaviors that might brought us where we are, but no longer serve us all that well, keeping us stuck. So some of the main takeaways, you're going to learn about 6 common blind spots that leaders, that all of us, to be honest, face. Identity, when your role evolves, but your self-concept doesn't. Motive, not seeing the true drivers behind your decisions and actions. Traits, overplaying strengths until they become your weaknesses holding you back. Emotions, failing to recognize and regulate your own or others' emotions, thinking, that is just how I am. Intellect, relying too heavily on one type of intelligence. I'm definitely guilty of that. IQ, speed, or creativity, or street smarts. When the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail or something along those lines. But when we guys rely only on one strength or one type of intellect, we tend to solve all of the problems with the same tool, where it might not be at all the most optimal solution. The 6th blind spots behavior, blind spots in our communication, in our influence, in our priorities. We're going to talk about all of this and how they can be holding us back and what to do about them, how to identify them and adjust our behaviors to overcome these blind spots so we could progress on our journey faster and better without getting stuck all that much. We're going to talk about how strengths often become our blind spots when they're overused in the wrong context. We're going to talk about meta-communication, communicating about the communication, which is a powerful way to clear misunderstandings fast and align our intentions with the impact the results we create. We're going to talk about 5 things only CEO can and should do. And as a bigger concept, we'll talk about this idea. Is your calendar aligned? Is what you do every day aligned with the role that you either want to occupy or occupy currently? And if there is no alignment, there might be a problem. Small tweaks matter more than big transformations. Like adjusting decisiveness with guardrails or changing the timing of your most important decisions, small tweaks become big changes. What you'll also learn in this episode, how to uncover and overcome blind spots in your leadership and career, why emotions are data and how to use them to guide your decisions. The 4 kinds of intellect leaders should balance in teams, practical strategies to align identity, behavior, and motives with the roles you aspire to get to, how to use the Blindspotting framework inside your organization to build more effective teams. This and a lot more very interesting, practical, applicable, and important stuff we're gonna cover on today's episode of Change Wired with Dr. Martin Dubin.
Somebody else's fault, or it's the company or the economy, just to kind of look at themselves and say, what's my part?
Yes. So we'll talk more about it during our conversation. So let's jump in. Thank you again so much, Marty, for joining ChangeWired podcast. It's such a pleasure for me personally, and I'm sure for our listeners to listen to this conversation and be exposed to your work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, Angela.
Yes, so before we jump into our conversation, can you tell our listeners a little bit of a backstory? So you have quite a career journey, I would say, from clinical psychologist to business owner to now one of the most, talked about coaches in the US and in leadership space. I think I want you to start with, how did it all start? Like even becoming clinical psychologist, how did you decide to become one?
Yeah, in college, I'll go back. So my father was a physician, and if you look at my initials, you can see that I was probably destined as the oldest son to follow in my father's footsteps. And I never really, I was curious about medicine, but I never really liked it that much. And I discovered psychology when I was in college, and I really wasn't that clear even about what kind of profession it was, but I just was curious about myself, as most of us are when we're at that age, and so that began the journey at that point.
Yes, and I guess when you got into that, we're thinking like, yes, this is the right choice. I guess probably yes, if you stayed. Well, what was you thinking once you got into?
Yeah, I did a little bit of kind of public mental health and a little bit of teaching, and then opened a private psychotherapy practice for adults. And I thought that's what I would do for my whole career, kind of open my office door every 45 or 50 minutes and have a new client come in. And I liked the work, but I actually didn't like sitting in an office all day long. And they don't teach you that in graduate school, like what's the life of the profession being. So I found myself just kind of searching around for other kinds of things, and healthcare was changing in the US, and I became curious about what was going on kind of on the business side of healthcare. And as I look back, I'd always done little business kinds, entrepreneurial kinds of things in college and earlier. So we'll talk about identity probably as a part of my chapter. The business wasn't really part of my identity. My identity was I'm a psychologist. But as I got into the business part, and we started with a couple colleagues, we started a company, managed the behavioral healthcare for very large insurance companies. And I was very intrigued with the whole aspects of business. So it opened up that part for me. And then we grew our company and ended up selling it to one of the largest health insurers. And then I discovered this whole area of coaching and got involved in that kind of at the third part of my career. And when I look back, I didn't start out to write a book. I just started out, it was during COVID, and to keep my brain engaged, I was just writing because I'd had an unusual career and kind of like, why did I say what I said to this particular client or that one, and what seemed to make a difference, and trying to really just understand my career, having worked from the basic psychology standpoint, having worked with people both with mental health problems as well as very successful leaders who wanted to get better. And so that's what kind of got me started. And then at some point I realized, oh, this is really a book. I should kind of get serious about it. And I started on the book journey.
Yeah, okay. That's how it came to be because when I was reading the book, I thought to myself, it seems like you've had it all along in you. But
Yeah.
also from experience, I know that when usually the book is out, you have a whole the lot of life experience, a journey that you went through before the book kind of ripened in you, and then you put it out. So yeah, you already started talking about the book and how it came to be. And yeah, you mentioned that it was the experience that you had, the thinking like, okay, what were the common things that I work with leaders, etc. Was there anything else that inspired you to write the book? And I don't know, maybe a difference that you want to make in the world, or what was the main motivator or for writing and for putting it out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't I don't know that I could articulate it when I was first writing it, that this was the reason, but it became pretty evident to me after a while. When I shifted to becoming a coach to business leaders, I kind of took a sabbatical for a year and read all I could about coaching. And then I ended up working with two of the premier coaching firms in the US. And I was I was really, quite frankly, very disappointed in that there wasn't really a science in my mind of coaching. There's a
Mhm.
science of leadership, very much so, and some very interesting and intriguing things about the science of leadership. But I was used to, as a psychotherapist, of having patient would come in the office and I have a categorization system, a diagnostic
Mhm.
categories, and a variety of different treatment techniques and tools to use depending on what the problems are. And I found coaching had none of that. There was really a lacking of a rigor and of a science. And if you think about it, all science kind of proceeds first by description, and then categorization, and then prediction, and then control. And you think about biology and chemistry and physics, that are hard sciences that have really done a lot in that way. And in the, brain sciences, it's so complex. We haven't proceeded much further than description and a little bit of
Mhm.
categorization. But none of that existed in coaching. And so that was the really the purpose of the book, is to create a taxonomy of what I call blind spots, areas where
Mhm.
leaders can get better. And it directs the coach and the leader to like what needs to be fixed. And
Yeah.
then I've got techniques and ideas in the book, and I hope it spurs more of this categorization and more application of what kind of tools and techniques work depending on what the problems are.
Uh, I think it's gonna do this and more. When I found your book, when I found out about your book at a Harvard Business Review, like their social media, I was just so happy because again, a lot of clients started to come to me with this specific problem. Like I know I'm not moving as far or as fast, or I know I'm doing something wrong, but I'm not exactly sure what it is, right? And the only word that came to my mind is was blind spots. And I'm like, okay, there must be a book on that, how to fix that. Right. And there was such a book and it just came out. I'm like, oh, how lucky I am. So thank you for writing it. And let's dive into the book a little bit further. So spotting, how to see what's holding you back as a leader. And I feel like a leader or a person in general, right? How to see what you can't see, which is holding you back. How do you define blind spots first and foremost? What are blind spots?
Yeah, I think the first thing that really kind of pointed me to kind of look at that was, as you well know, a traditional thing that coaches do is collect feedback, what's called a 360, about
Yeah.
the leader from everybody around. And no matter how you, and I do that by an interview format, and when you do that, the responses tend to fall into two categories, no matter what questions you ask. What is the leader great at, and where are they not so great? Where are the opportunities for them to improve? And I think, like most coaches, kind of saw those as two separate categories, and most of the leaders that I talked to weren't that interested in the strengths part. They knew all of that. They were real curious about their impact on people and where they were missing the boat. And at some point, I started to realize that often the opportunities that need to be addressed were actually the flip side of the exact same thing that people were talking about as the person's strengths.
Mm,
And that it was their strengths work most of the time and in most situations, but yeah, and they're the go-to tool for the leader because it's part of their default personality. But there are times when leaders would be using that strength and it was the inappropriate to the particular situation, and the leaders weren't aware of it because why would they be? It works for them almost all the time. And that was the first little key that started to unlock for me that around self-awareness. I mean, the book is a book about self-awareness.
hmm.
And the first one was about that your strengths overplayed can actually become a problem.
Yeah. So, and I I think reading your book made it for the first time really clear to me that what I take so much pride in
Yes.
actually also what's holding me back. Because in every situation, that is my answer to everything, right? But as you just mentioned, it's not the right answer to everything, and very often that actually backfires in so many ways, and you are not really aware of that. And very often, to that point, not all of the people who will give you feedback also can give you the kind of feedback that you can hear and in the way that makes sense and you can use to correct your behavior, right? So, speaking to your blind spots and strengths, and well, your book is divided in six parts, and I really love the structure because it kind of, yeah, it covers everything from what I can think of, at least. And as you said, it's like very well structured and allows one to use it as a almost like a map to identify where the blind
Yes.
spots or the gaps. So, the six parts are identity, motive, traits, emotions, intellect, and behavior. Could you maybe go through them and identify what are those areas? I call them areas of blind spots because obviously they can be in so many shapes and forms.
Yeah, as I was writing the book, as we talked about, I reflected about my history both as a psychotherapist and as a coach. And really, and in psychotherapy, I think these same things are applicable in psychotherapy as they are in coaching. I mean, like what are the areas of who we are as people? There really isn't a well agreed upon personality model for normal personality. There's pathology and what that looks like. And so that was my challenge, was to construct a bit of a map, as you said, of our
Hmm.
personality in terms of our self-awareness, because that's what I'm after, and that's what all coaches are, helping the leader become more self-aware. And so the territory, I had maybe six or eight or nine things, and at different points I kind of pulled it into these six. And they are natural words, part of our everyday language. They should be intuitively recognizable to people. And I think about it in terms of what we're most aware of. The diagram that I have for this is like
Hmm.
a target, three concentric circles, kind of a center and then a ring and then an outside ring. And the outside ring is what we're most aware of, what's easiest for us to access, and that's our identity and our behavior. And I mean, we see our behavior, other people see it. Our identity, or kind of the name tags we wear. I am
Hmm.
a mother, father, son, psychologist, engineer. So we are pretty accessible to most of those things. There still are blind spots in both of those areas. And then the next ring are things that are a little more hardwired. They're harder for us to get a hold of, but we still recognize them. Our intellect, our emotions, and our traits. And then at the core is what's driving us, kind of the
Mm-hmm.
engine in the system, and that's our motives or our needs, our drives. And those we can sometimes we're very aware I'm doing this because of this. This matters to me, but rarely are we singularly motivated. We have many motives that are going on, and sometimes, many times, we're not aware of those motives. So that's kind of at the core. And the motives really then kind of emanate out through all those other parts. The diagram has dotted lines in between all of these because all these parts interact and have feedback to each
Mm-hmm.
other all the time.
Yes, it's again such a great structure, and immediately also could recognize that a lot of it in myself, how it works, and also in the clients that I work with. Like to that point, for example, when I start working with someone, I always together we try to create an identity that we are striving
Mm.
to create through different behavior change, right? Who,
Yes,
why am I changing this? So that's also touches the motive, but then also like who am I as this person
yes.
doing these things, and that tends to work so well for also to maintain that discipline or motivation, which often is required to create behavioral change. Maybe let's dive in a little bit of detail in each one, and maybe you can give some examples so listeners also can figure out, okay, this is what we are talking about, and these are some of the signs that I might have some blind spots there, and like maybe a ways to address it. So, where would you like to start? From the core, or like in the book you started with identity, which
Yeah, I think we could go through the chapters. I mean, I organized
okay,
them that I kind of thought maybe the clearest way for people to get a idea and the stories were the way that I organized the chapters. So we could start anywhere, but
yeah.
that's a good place.
Let's start with identity. So, what are blind spots in that area of identity, and maybe some stories, for example, and how people
Sure.
can figure out if they have some blind spots there to work on?
Yeah, and as I said before, that your personality and who you are works if you're successful and you're doing well, it works most of the time. So in each of these, it's the point is what are the blind spots and what are the triggers? Why would you have a blind spot? And for
Mm-hmm.
identity, it often happens when you're at times of change in your role. So an identity blind spot is when your identity and your role are not perfectly aligned. So for example, you're a subject matter expert, domain expert in a particular area. You're a graphic designer and you're working at a company and you get a promotion to become now a manager. That's a shift in your role and there's an identity shift. And if you stay stuck in I'm the best designer and and all your efforts, and if somebody looks at how you spend your time at work, it's all on
Mm-hmm.
designing, then you haven't shifted to the new role, which is a manager of other designers. And you clearly obviously use that subject matter expertise to inform how you manage, but your identity should change and along with your role change, and you hopefully would be getting gratification from that new identity. If you find out that you're struggling with that, you don't like the management part of it, even though it's a salary increase and other things, then that's a real time for you to take a deep question, as you kind of said earlier, about who am I and what am I
Mm-hmm.
really interested in. So the goal here is to get your identity and your role change well aligned. And when it isn't, those are the times when your blind spots occur. You could go to work for a new company and find out that somehow it's not fitting for you. And when you really think about it, maybe the goals of the company, the culture of the company, the mission of the company isn't resonating for who you are. And so your identity hasn't shifted to fit with the identity of the new company. So any of these mismatches are
Mm-hmm.
opportunities when you can kind of explore a potential blind spot that's holding you back from being as effective as you can be in your job.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important notion of being effective in the role that you're choosing. And that's where I think it's very important, before taking on any role is to identify, okay, what's this role is about? what it
Right.
means to be effective here. What's the goal? What's the outcome? Like if you're trying to be, I don't know, a manager, right? Or what's a good manager does? If you're getting into CEO or any C-suite position, like what does it mean to be great at that position? What are my responsibilities? What should be on my schedule? And that goes also to your behaviors, right? And then you're also like, such a great point that it's not like either or you have to like change. No, if you don't want to change and it's really not who
Right.
you're comfortable with being, you just don't choose it and choose something else. And I think
Yeah, and
that's so important. Yeah.
you bring up a good point about getting ready for the change. And you can be aspiring to the next role and and you're waiting for the opportunity to come. And so the advice I give, and there's a couple examples in the book, is to act as if you're in the role. So you're not yet in that new role, but you start to, as you said, observe and think about what's the responsibilities of that role, what is the requirements of that role, how does that change from who I am today or what I'm doing today, and you begin to start to act as if you're already in that role. Obviously not in a way that's counter to the culture and getting along well with people, but you then start to advertise. We all have brands. Our identity is kind of a brand at work. And you then start to change your brand and people start to say, oh, they don't consciously say they're acting like the next role, but they start to see you speaking up more, bringing up ideas that are considered for that next leadership step. And pretty soon people see that you're ready for that because they see you already behaving in that way.
Yes, it's also reminds me of a few cases in from my coaching where uh, my clients would bring to me this issue of like, well, there is this role next level, but I know that I'm not even considered.
Hmm.
Right? And then I would ask, well, how would your like the person who considers people for this position, how would they know that you even want this role?
Right.
Right? Did you talk to them? Did you do something? Did you ask for like certain project, etc.? And then they realize that yes, they nobody's reading your mind, and if you're not somehow behaving in a way or speaking up about that, then it's hard to see that you are now want to be in that position with that identity. And that well, we can jump into the next one, which is I think it's what is it, motive in the book?
Motive. Mhm.
Yes, that. But I also feel like the identity. It's so and also it's in the graphic in your book. It's aligned well in the same circle as behavior, and I feel like identity and behavior are so interlinked because
Yes.
more, as you said, it's your identity is your brand in a sense that how you behave is how your identity usually perceived by others.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's what other people see about you. And, you know, as you well know, so many leaders talk, you give them a 360 feedback and they read something, they say, I never said that, or that's not right. And it's the difference between your intention and your impact. So the behavior is what other people see. It's the impact about other people. Your intention might be in your motive about why you're
Yeah.
doing something, but there can be, how it shows up for other people in your behavior can be very, very different.
Yeah, well, the behavior will I think we'll talk about that
Sure.
throughout the whole yes
Yes.
conversation because that's as you write it, that's what people see. Let's talk about motive, what it is, and how people, what kind of blind spots leaders can have in that area, and how they know that they have it there.
Yeah, I mean, you can think about we all do this, right? We're all armchair psychologists. We're all trying to figure out the people around us and ourselves. So, how often have you said, oh, you know, she's only doing that for the fame, or he's only doing that for the money? And so we are, trying to assume and figure out what is somebody's motive. Obviously, that's how we negotiate our way through life, figure out other people. So, it's important to know as a leader that everybody's trying to figure out what your motives are. And obviously, the more you know your motives, the more you can be declarative about them and say, I'm doing this because this is what's important to me. And then we all do that in a natural way. So when I was in graduate school or undergraduate, maybe, I remember reading, there's a Harvard psychologist, organizational psychologist, David McClellan,
Hmm.
who wrote about three core motives in organizations and in business life, power, affiliation, and achievement. And I've found those to just ring so true. We have lots of other motives. We have our own personal life history and, motives to, make friends or prove ourselves or we're, the whole sense of imposter syndrome that lurks beneath the surface with people. But those three core motives and how well they're balanced, and where we are on those are a good place to start. So that's a place for people to think about, why am I doing this? How much of it is for these three different reasons? Power is for control over people and situations. Money's often a measure of power. Achievement is doing a good job for the sake of doing a good job and what that means to us. It's not for approval from anybody else. It's our own sense of how important that is. And affiliation is love and companionship and relationships and doing something for those kinds of motives. And so being in touch with how those three motives are interplaying in your life, and maybe when you're stuck in some situation that isn't working well and you're in a meeting and you can tell people aren't tracking with what you're saying and you're losing the group and you're trying to influence them in a particular way, one place to start is like, what's important to me right now? What's important to these
Hmm.
people I'm talking to right now? And where am I on these three motives of affiliation, achievement, and power, and trying to adjust as necessary?
Hmm. Yeah, I think for me, it's also like one of the hardest to
Hmm.
identify very often. Where, like in my work, where when I work with clients, when they start struggling with like, all right, this is what I want to change, but then it's somehow like when we start working on certain behaviors and they've always like all often find a reason why they can't do it or why it's not working
Right.
out. That's where I actually start asking like, what were you trying to achieve? Like, what's important to you,
What's
right? I don't
important?
know.
Yes.
Yeah. And I was getting there, and I find that actually this breakdown of behavior and intention very happens at this motive level where they don't really want what they say they want because they're
Yeah.
driven by something else,
Yeah,
right?
that's
And
really well articulated. Yeah. And and that emotion, the emotion seems to me to be kind of the road to what's really important to them. I mean, they'll talk about, well, I'm frustrated right now, or this is what makes me happy, or, all of a
Mhm,
sudden I felt a warm feeling, or all of a sudden I felt frustrated. And so when your drives and your needs, your motives are being blocked, you have that
mhm,
sense of frustration, of discomfort.
mhm.
When those motives and needs are being realized, you have that sense, that warm feeling of fulfillment and a good feeling. So often we are confused about our motives because,
Yeah.
there's so many choices, and what do we really want? And so getting a hold of the feelings and starting to search those, the feelings will tell us the truth about ourselves.
Yeah, it's sort of our inner compass that just doesn't lie. And you can talk yourself almost into, I don't know, any belief or I guess what I'm trying to say is like feelings, you can't really fake it. You can't make
No.
yourself feel something that is not true to you. And that's why it's such a great compass. For me, for example, I know that when I make difference in people's lives or when I add to knowledge area that is important to me, I feel like really good. Like my day wasn't a waste, right? And that's why I know like these are my motives, and as long as I align my work and my life with them, like I'll be happy.
Right. Yeah,
And
exactly. That's exactly
s-
right. And people see that about you, right? They see that you're driven to do that. And so, obviously your clients want to see that in you because they know that's going to be helpful to them. So our motives really often are very clear to other people, sometimes before they're clear to us.
yes, exactly. And especially if we are not so maybe used to talking about our emotions, right? And
Right.
that leads to the next blind spot area our emotions. And I found that, and you found that in your work as well, that some people are more emotionally aware, some people less. And I feel like the more emotionally aware people are, the also easier it is to understand your motives, like when you're aligned with them or not.
Yes, I talk about this in the emotion chapter, kind of about 5 levels and of sophistication, really, in being able to use your understanding of your motives in a strategic way. That's what the book is about in each of these chapters. Once you get a hold of your self-awareness and you understand what your blind spot is in each of these different areas, then you have more choice. You can always change your behavior. You can always, so if you're feeling something very strongly and you're not aware of it, it's showing and it's coming out in your behavior. Once you become aware of it, then you have an ability to make a decision about, do I want to show my feelings or not? In what way do I want to show them? How do I want to show them? So it's, and I've met many leaders that just see emotions as getting in the way of work. And I tell them, I say, it's just data. If you're
Yeah.
ignoring your emotions or you're ignoring other people's, you give a great presentation and you've got all the logic and yet people haven't gotten on board and you're upset about that and you realize it's because of their emotions, of their interests, of other things, not a logical analysis. Well, then you need to get on board with that other data set of their emotions and what's important to them, and that should go into your presentation as well as all the rational arguments that you've got.
Yes. And speaking about emotions, how leaders and people can identify how how emotionally, I don't know if I'm trying to find the right word, how emotionally aware and effective they are. What are some of the signs? Like you mentioned that maybe if a leader cannot relate to the emotions of employees or teammates, or what are some other signs that the person might not be as emotionally, again, proficient as they'd like to be, or as it can be beneficial to what they're trying to do?
Right. So all these things about us, I mean, psychologists think that most human characteristics are along a bell curve, a natural distribution. So we all are that way with all of these things. Some of us are more aware of our emotions than others, and just in a natural way of the way we're built. So it is for some people, it does take a fair bit of effort because it just doesn't naturally come up to them. So, but we're always tuned into this in other people. I mean, communication theorists talk about 90+% of what's communicated is communicated non-verbally, and that is people's emotions. You see that. And so sometimes it just takes a practice of starting to become aware, and you can become aware of your physical feelings, a sense of tightness in your chest or in your
Mm-hmm.
neck, something which says you're feeling something and it's showing up physically. And then it just begins a practice of starting to ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Or why was I upset in the meeting that I just left? And taking
Mm-hmm.
that extra 10 minutes just to kind of begin to become self-aware and start to notice things. And as you do, you'll start to notice things in other people. The leaders that can, quote, read the room really well, what they're reading is those emotional reactions that they're seeing in physical behavior of people. And I had one leader tell me that his direct report was told him, he said, stop screaming. And he said, I know I was not screaming. I've worked hard on modulating my voice and I was not screaming. And he told her that. And she said, your face was screaming. And he said, you got me, of course. I was upset about this. And so what would have been the best thing for him to say is, I'm upset right now. That being able to, when you can recognize what you're feeling and articulate it, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the energy that we're kind of trying to, hold back our feelings gets dissipated by just the acknowledgement and the verbalization of it. And then, it can be something you smile and laugh about or something you're able to control and just show in a minor kind of way. But emotions really become problematic when we try not to recognize
Mm-hmm.
them and we try to push them down.
Yes, yeah, either in ourselves or other people, right? Even I feel like if someone is not great with maybe reading the exact emotional context, you can always ask, right? Well,
Yes.
like but it seems like you are experiencing, a certain emotion and it's hard for me to read it, right? And the person will tell you more, like why they're experiencing what they're experiencing and maybe what's the reason and why it's important.
Yeah, in the behavior chapter, I talk about three complex behaviors, and one of them is communication. And what you just talked about is this technique of meta communication, communicating about the communication. It's taking yourself out of the interaction for a moment, and then commenting on it. So to say, I can't read your emotion is commenting about what's going on in your interaction. And or I'm feeling like we're off kilter with each other right now. I don't quite know
Hmm.
why. Any of those things are, instead of just staying caught in it, when you can remove yourself and pull yourself out of it and talk about it, you open up a whole new ability to be able to bridge the
Yeah.
gap and improve the communication. And often it is around feelings or what's happening.
Yes, I always actually what I say, you introduce this new phrase into my vocabulary, meta communication. What I would usually say, like over communicate. Whatever it is on your mind, all of your assumptions, just say it out
Right.
loud so everyone can see it. And then you can actually communicate on the same level versus like you say something and then you think something and then somebody says something in reply to what they thought you said but you never said it, right? And you have this like several communication, only a couple of which are visible. And I found that when leaders start doing that, their just like ability to be effective with people, yeah, goes several levels up.
Yeah, I think that's a beginning. That's an important step. Is that kind of over communication, like you said, to get to get more articulate about it, more thoughtful and strategic about it. And once you get good about all that, you don't have to over communicate. You can be strategic, and maybe you decide to over communicate because you
Hmm.
think that's what's going to work here. Maybe you think maybe it's a negotiation and you don't really want to show all your cards, but
Yeah.
you have all that awareness that you just talked about going on in your head. And so then you're deciding, what do you want to share and what do you want to show and what do you want to hold back?
Yeah, so that's the next level of awareness.
Right.
Instead of having blind spots, you have like all this. I would say even not extreme, but just very good clarity of what's happening. And but also a little note about your book. As you tried, as you said, to introduce some sort of taxonomy or just different, I guess, vocabulary or the way to talk about these things, I feel like your book introduced so many of those like also sub layers of, or this is like, your emotional sort of proficiency and it has that many levels. Or like, as we're going to talk about intellect, there are four types of intellect and this how you can spot them. And once you have this vocabulary, you even that already makes you more aware of like these things exist. And then that gives you an ability to spot them in yourself or in other people.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And there's two things about what you just said that I hope happens with this book. One is that it does become part of everybody's vocabulary, and you can say, "Oh, I think I just had an emotional blind spot there," or you can say that to somebody else, "Is that an identity blind spot?" And that this becomes
Hmm.
just part of normal vernacular, like other kind of tools that have been in coaching and in psychology. And the other part of my writing the book is, I'm not a researcher. I didn't, have a have 100 people go through some experiment to prove out these things
Yeah.
in the chapters. It's my own being a psychologist with one person at a time and trying to really understand them. And so my other hope is that people will read these chapters and say, well, there really aren't four intellect. Maybe it's six, or maybe it's three. And
Hmm.
that maybe I could help generate, a couple hundred PhD theses doctoral dissertations that people try to really prove this out and see what works and what doesn't work. So I hope I'm kind of, as you said, kind of creating a map that people then can really try to, make some sense out of.
Yeah, make sense out of and then build on it,
Build.
and then
Yes.
exactly bring more precision maybe into that. But it
Yes.
definitely sparks curiosity, and it's like, ah, I didn't think about that this way. Now I do, so I want to explore more of that. And especially around intellect, as I already started talking about that,
Mhm.
that I think was my favorite part actually, because I think my biggest blind spot is actually in this arena. Since I was a kid, I was praised for being smart, right? And like I read a lot, I go through a lot of information really fast. And I always thought that that is like such a superpower. But then I did a few assessments, and after reading your book, especially, I'm like, ah, that was almost my like to go all one tool that I try to solve almost every problem. And that's not because all the other tools were not available or I wasn't aware of them, but it just became, as you said, such a super strength that it sort of eliminated everything else. And I started using in every single case. So intellect, let's talk about that and four types that you
Yeah.
named there and how one can sort of spot which one might be their dominant one and how do I
Yeah.
identify?
So
Go ahead.
yeah. So in this chapter, as in the others, as we're talking about, the idea is that we have certain strengths, we have certain default personality characteristics that we go to, and realizing that what we think is natural and normal, everybody else has their own definition of what's natural and normal, and really being able to see that there's a broader perspective is helpful. So, I psychology, my profession is probably most responsible for getting this over-indexing on IQ and
Hmm.
intelligence and what I call that horsepower in the chapter. That type of intelligence is certainly associated with high achievement in academic pursuits and in much of life. But we all have people that we see rise to great success, and they don't have that particular type of intelligence in the greatest degree. And so it's like, what else is going on there? And so I think that type of processing and a lot of information and being able to really analyze that well is one type. The second type I talk about is processing speed, which you sound like you have that one as well, which are people that are able to take all that information and do something with it in the moment, not like, okay, I need to go back and think about it and I'll come back with my answer later. That's horsepower without the speed. But the processing speed is people are able to really pull things together in a comprehensive way and articulate it kind of in the moment. And that clearly is another skill set. I worked a lot with venture capitalists who were really trying to understand business opportunities, and they're very good at this processing
Hmm.
speed very quickly. Another type of intelligence is creative intelligence. And these are the people that often make these connections that other people don't see and that sometimes they just seem distracting. Like, what are you talking about? That has no
Hmm.
relation to the problem we're trying to solve. But if you let them speak about it, or sometimes they don't even really know how they made that connection. But if they begin to process and articulate the connection, all of a sudden you start to see, oh wow, there is something here that we're missing, and what they're bringing in is really often a game changer kind of way of looking at things. And then the fourth category is a little bit of a catch-all, but it's these people that I call street savvy, street smarts, business acumen. They're kind of head on a pivot. They're just always noticing all sorts of things going on. Kind of emotional intelligence is certainly a part of this, but it's often very strategic. It's seeing kind of the downstream implications of what's happening and the data they're pulling together. And they may be just, average in terms of kind of IQ type of intelligence, but they're really picking up on all sorts of other cues. So, my advice is try to figure out where your strengths are in those and realize that the best decisions are probably made by inputs from all these different kinds of intellects,
Hmm.
and surround yourself with people that bring in all of this. And a leader who's constructing a team around them should try to identify people that have these different kinds of intelligence and bring them into the decision making and problem solving process. If you just have the high horsepower people solving a problem, you'll get great analysis, but it may not actually fly in the light of day where
Hmm.
the street savvy person could have helped you with, or it may miss something very big that the creative person could have helped you with.
Yes, and I could definitely recognize myself, for example, that I probably don't have that much street smart, as you call it, because I have all these like strategic ideas and I see like I can analyze stuff, but actually getting stuff
Yeah.
like done, business-wise as well, not my thing. And that's why probably I haven't built, such a great business. And I think, the saddest part about that is that you don't even see it because once you are aware of it, you can use your intellect to work on it. But
Yes.
when you're not aware of it, it's like it's not working and you don't know why. Right?
Yeah, I mean, you just articulated the whole thesis of the book, right?
Yeah.
There's great leadership science out there, and you and I could read about what's the best way to engineer a change management process at work or something like that. And we can both take away the 5 or 10 lessons out of that. But the impact of how we apply those is filtered through who we are in terms of our personality. And, you might overstress certain things in that. I might overstress other things in that. I might miss certain things in that change process because it just doesn't register as strongly for me,
Yes.
even though intellectually I get it. And so that's why this self-awareness is, in my mind, the most important leadership tool for a leader.
Yes, and speaking about that self-awareness, right? You have this whole book. So how would you recommend leaders to approach the application of what's in the book to increase that self-awareness and to put then in practice what they learn about themselves, about their possible blind spots?
Yeah, so it is exactly that. It's awareness and then action. I mean, you mentioned before about how you feel good about when your clients make a connection, you help them see something. And that's very important, but that is just step one. When somebody says, "Oh, I understand now why I don't do that right or why that gets in my way." Okay, but now what are you going to do about it? And often that's small things. I've found that small changes, small tweaks, once we have self-awareness, can have a large change in our behavior. So first, I think people should approach this whole process with the idea that this is not about anything like transformation. You can't transform your personality anyway, nor should you. I mean, you're fine who you are. So it's figuring out where are those it's really important places to make a small change. Coaching is, the term often comes from sports and athletics. And if you look at what goes on with elite athletes, it's small tweaks that make a huge change. The golfer that changes his grip on the golf club a quarter of an inch and gets an extra 10 or 20 yards on his drive or more precision. So that's what we're talking about. So first it's figuring out the awareness, and then it's figuring out what change will have a different kind of impact on my leadership. What little change in my behavior will have an impact? So each chapter in the book has those two steps. It has a step of awareness and a step of action.
Action.
And they're just kind of more thought experiments. Obviously, I didn't write a how-to book because
Hmm.
everybody's how-to is going to look different. But it's a good place to start. We also have developed a blind spotting
Assessment. Yeah.
test because if they are blind spot, it is blind spots. It is hard for you to see them. So the blind spotting test is you can take it takes 10 minutes. It's based on a long-standing psychological organizational psychology test, and it'll help, as you said earlier, have a compass to kind of point in the way of where you might be getting in your own way and having trouble, and then it starts to give some pointers on what you can do about it.
Hmm. And I think, very important, at least in my mind, is understand like, what are you trying to achieve with that, right?
Right.
Because whatever you're aware of in yourself, it's like also in all of the stories in the book, some leaders that you work with, some founders or business owners, yeah, they know things about themselves and they know that it might be hurting, but they're like, that's fine. I don't want to change anything about that. I feel like that is such an important thing to understand, like where are you going in your life? And if you're already like getting everything you want, then maybe it's not a thing to change, right? So there should be like this motive to why do that in the first place.
Right. And sometimes the change is not changing yourself at all, but just surrounding yourself with people, as I said earlier, with the intellect that are complementary to you. So
Yeah.
you don't have to make any change other than use that awareness to say, I'm not that great in these particular kind of situations, or I tend to over index on a particular trait of mine. And so I need to kind of watch for that. And I'm going to bring these people in when so that I don't make that kind of mistake again.
Yes.
We didn't talk about traits, and just to give a real quick one on
Yes.
that, because
I
that's the most
forgot that.
yeah, that's the most common area, right? That's what leadership books are full of, or what are the leadership
Yeah.
traits? And these are, as you said earlier, these are the strengths that we like about ourselves, but often get overplayed. And so I tell people one way to get an idea of where that is. So, if your super strength is you're confident, or you're decisive, or you're organized, or you're creative, just put the modifier TOO in front of it. What happens when you're too creative? What happens when you're too
Yeah.
organized? What happens when you're too decisive? And those are probably things that your partners or your friends often tell you about yourself, that you're overplaying your strength and it doesn't work in certain situations. So with that awareness, you can start to say, what do I look like when I'm too decisive? Well, I start to cut off communication. I say I'm done. I'm ready to move on. So you may not be aware that you're being too decisive, but you can be aware that when I start to cut conversation off, when I think I'm done, that's my little clue that I might be becoming too decisive and making a decision too early. And I can catch that sense in myself and then make that small little change of just saying, all right, I'm not going to cut things off right now. I'm going to say to the person I'm
Hmm.
talking to, let's continue this conversation a little bit more next week. I think I'm ready for a decision, but I need to think about it a little bit more. And that little tiny tweak, all of a sudden makes you appear not so overly decisive, not so dismissive of others.
Yeah, and probably helps you also to look perhaps into decisions with a little bit more deliberation or just
Yes.
to make also because like too decisive. I think I'm also on that side. And what how it can play out in a negative sense is like you're so decisive that you don't take enough time to actually consider all the possible downsides of your decision, right? And you make it and then they're like, oh shoot, right? I did not consider all of
Right.
these things
Right.
deciding. And now for my side, on my side, I create for different decisions, different time frames. Like, for example, buying decisions, I make certain buying decisions only on Saturday, right? Or if I'm not sure about commitment, I usually say, let me think about that. And I actually make decision in a couple of days after that, right? Because I know that I'm more in the sense like, yes, let's do this or no, and then might regret later. So I also call this practice of setting guardrails. Okay,
Yeah.
you know that about yourself, right? So
Yeah.
put the systems in place where you know you're not gonna do your best or exercise your best judgment.
And that's beautiful. I mean, those are such small little changes, right? Do it on Saturday. You know,
Yeah.
um, say I'll think about it some more. I mean, you're not changing your personality. You're changing those little tweaks in your behavior that then have these great results for you.
Yes, and again, like I think this book is so amazing in a sense that it helps you to become like aware in these different areas, your identity, your emotions, your traits, your intellect about all these different things you didn't know you had possibly, and then that helps you to start looking at like, maybe I'm not getting result because of this or that. But I think like even when people just read the book, they will start seeing themselves in many different situations because I also want to mention to listeners that the book has so many stories and it's almost
Yes.
impossible not to see yourself in one of the stories if you have that. So that's also feel like such a brilliant way to write this book.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's very story driven. I mean, including my story at points and the stories of the people and I've had feedback that these are very relatable stories. Sometimes we read books that they've kind of tweaked this story to make it just fit their point so well. And you'll read in the book, I mean, there's lots of people that don't make, changes and that have problems here. And there's others that use coaching or other self-awareness to make an adjustment. So yeah, people should see themselves and other people pretty clearly in all these different stories.
Yes, the book has, again, it's so rich in information and practical value. There are also the interesting things, at least I found them very interesting, around specific CEO behaviors or how, like, I never actually thought about that deeply about the what behavior CEO should
Right.
engage in or and should not. Can you maybe speak to that as well? Because, for example, well, listeners of this podcast, many either in founder or transitioning to CEO, and many leaders in general, like, okay, now I'm in this more leadership position. What things should I do? So, can you speak to those five activities or
Sure.
how do you call them? I forgot that
Being,
CEO
yeah,
should engage with.
this, I was really influenced by an article I read that was, oh, it's probably 20 years old at this point, from A.G. Lafley, who was the CEO of Procter and Gamble. And the title of the article was "What Can Only the CEO Do?" And it's that only word. And I found I've done a lot of work with entrepreneurs and leaders, and when I ask a leader that, it's been so interesting how I get this, like, I've never really thought about that. The only part means in your role. What is only your role can do this. So it applies
Mhm,
for other roles as well. And I think for the CEO, and many of these five apply to most of the other roles too, there's five things that only the CEO can do. First, the CEO can is the only person that can actually pick their team. So if HR picked their team or if they inherited a team, then they are not exercising that thing that only they can do. Do they really have the right people around them? And because, as I've said earlier here, we all have our own different personalities. The right people around you and the right people around me are going to be different. So that's
mhm,
one. Number two is the CEO is the champion of the culture of the company. And if they don't it doesn't mean they do culture things all the time, but that they own
mhm,
it in their brain and they how they carry themselves at work and outside of work and what initiatives that they push and how communication appears. All those things are about culture, and culture is so powerful in companies. So knowing that only the CEO really owns the culture at the top. The strategic decisions for the company, clearly you share those with the board or with your senior team, but at the end of the day, the leader makes those strategic decisions and those priority decisions of what do we spend money on this year and
mhm,
versus next year? What are the three priorities for this year and for next year? And owning those and knowing that those are really only up to the CEO. And finally, there are certain relationships that only the CEO owns that the board, certain key customers, maybe government regulators, whoever it might be. And if you defer those to your or delegate those to your sales team to meet with these important customers, and that customer wants to talk to only the CEO for certain things, and you need to know that and be very thoughtful. And so you can look at your calendar and say, am I covering these? If I look at my calendar, am I covering these five things that I know only I can do? Or is my calendar filled up with other activities where I'm really, adding value for sure, but I'm neglecting these five things that I really should be taking care of. And either somebody else is doing them or it's not getting done.
mhm. And I think that that is such a key thing to understand in general in any position in leadership. Like, what are the key things that only I can do, and prioritize those first on your calendar
Right.
before any other activities. And that's where I feel like it's not only applicable to CEOs, but also to anyone in a leadership position asking themselves this question, like, what are the things that only I can do in this position, and
Right.
then prioritize that. So it's, again, another such a great piece in the book. And so, Marty, I want to be mindful of your time again. I could be talking to you about the content of the book for ages, but you have other things to do. So, to conclude our episode, a couple of things of homework for our listeners. I always like to give our listeners homework.
Hmm.
How would you approach diving into the book book and then taking it to more practical level? Like what people should do? Let's say they read the book. What are the next couple of steps that you would like them to take?
Yeah, I mentioned in the first chapter of the book that I think you can read the book in different ways. You could read it all the way through and just kind of maybe take mental notes or underscore certain things that you want to come back to. And the book has a appendix in the back of all the, I have these 6 areas and I have probably 60 or more blind spots listed. So you can do that. You can then go back and say, I want to open that identity chapter again, and that resonated for me. Or you can read the book and stop when you get to something that's really resonates for you and dig deeper into it. And again, at the end of each chapter, there are some questions to get you thinking more
Mhm.
about it. So those are, I think, a couple ways to turn the book into some kind of an action way for you. We've created it with some colleagues. I've created a website, blindspotting.com. And so we have a
Mhm.
lot of more content there, some other ways to begin to think about all this. That assessment that I mentioned, where you can take an assessment to try to understand your blind spots, you can find that on blindspotting.com as well. So those are a few areas to kind of take action.
Yeah, it's amazing. This I'm gonna link all the stuff that you mentioned, the website. Also, I'm gonna link the assessment, the book. Mm, Another question that I have: what what is the success? We kind of already briefly talked about that, but maybe could you say again what in your mind is success for this book, for this venture that the book is? Let's say we're talking in 3, 5 years. Where
Mhm.
would you like to see go? And what impact, I guess, to create.
Yeah, so the book's when you and I are doing this podcast, the book's been out for I think 2 weeks at this point, so it's all brand new. And I'll give you kind of a non-answer answer, I guess. But this is my first book, and people say, "Isn't it like Or there's the thing of it's like you birth a child or something, and it's more like you have created a child that's now become independent. The book is doing things that I mean, it's a physical, it's not an organic thing, but it's
Yeah.
just been. I mean, it sparked all sorts of ideas in you and in other people, and I guess I'm almost more curious just to see what happens. I hope
Mhm.
it's very useful in that kind of way you and I spoke about, kind of a map, a taxonomy, a way to begin to organize your thinking, just make things so it's not all just kind of a buzzing confusion. It kind of points people in directions. And I'm just very curious to see where it goes. There's one organization, a good sized company, a $500 million privately held company that has really embraced it, and it's become part of the vernacular in the company. They're using it all sorts of ways, blind spotting, and so I think there might be a bit of a contagion effect in some ways, as because I think it is very approachable and people just understand it intuitively. And so I'm just curious to see how people are going to be using it, and I hope they do.
Yes, I'm sure they will do. I'm going to be one of the facilitators to make sure that more people use it. You actually sparked one question that I feel is important. You mentioned the organization that is using your book. How would you suggest, let's say a leader is listening to this podcast
Mm.
and they have a team or they lead a whole organization. How would you suggest they use the book inside their organization to help the concepts in the book to create more effective teams and people?
Yeah, so back to that question of what can only the leader do, and I mentioned about the culture, things start with the leader. So the leader if a leader is engaged with the book and finds it really useful, I think they can start with themselves and say, here's what I learned about myself. I get a lot of questions about how do you give feedback effectively, and there's some guidelines in the
Mhm.
book and lots of things about that, but it starts with you sharing about yourself. And so the leader can say, here's what this book has meant to me, and here's what I've learned about myself. And I've noticed I think I have this blind spot, and and here's what I'm doing to not have it affect my leadership in an adverse way. And can you all help me with that? Hold me accountable, help point it out to me. So just even beginning with that kind of a conversation, and
Mhm.
then I think, then the next step, and I wouldn't rush this, it would be I would like everybody to read the book in my team right here and have us have an exercise where we all do this kind of sharing. And we
Mhm.
all help each other and hold each other accountable. And actually, we're working on a team report from the blind spotting test where
Hmm.
a team can say, where are our team blind spots? Where are we? So I think that'll evolve. But I think that would be a good beginning step for a leader. And it should be fun, quite frankly. I mean, the stories are interesting and fun, and as I said,
No.
it should be these small tweaks. So this isn't a huge lift that for people to do.
Yeah, maybe also a suggestion if somebody has a book club in their company.
Yes,
Like I'm a part, for example, of one of the book clubs with a HR group of people, right? And we have our monthly book club. So I would suggest the book for sure. So that I think another great way to engage with the contents of the book, just make it a part of the book club and then discuss, and then all kinds of ideas will spark how one can apply it in the organization. So that's that. And the last question, where you want people to go and connect with you, besides your work, I'm going to
sure.
link the website and everything, but also with you personally, what are the best way people can follow you and your work?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I have an author website, martindubin.com, and you can find me there and I'm posting events and podcasts and other things, speaking that I'm doing. And I'm on LinkedIn. So any of those places would be great places. And yeah, and I enjoy that. I've been getting feedback from people about how they're using the book, and we can have a collaboration at a distance in that way.
Yeah, so I'm gonna link all of this in the show notes as well. Highly recommend people to connect with you on LinkedIn, on website, whatever social media you have, and just follow the journey of you and your work. And I'm sure it's gonna unfold in so many beautiful ways, especially with AI and everything that you can do with it these days to
Yes.
spread your work to more people. So, Martin, again, thank you so much for doing the work, for writing the book. It's been a pleasure to also talk with you. So thank you so much. Really appreciate what you've done here.
Thank you, Angela. Lovely conversation. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you.